If the thought of negotiating makes you want to crawl under the desk and disappear, you're not alone. But you also don't have to keep leaving money or other desired outcomes on the table. Negotiating shows up in many areas of our lives, not just salary negotiations. It happens with our friends, our kids, our spouse, our parents. Negotiation is about communication, not winning or losing. So let's talk about why it makes us so uncomfortable and what to do about it so that we can start to negotiate confidently and gracefully in the areas that matter most to us. I'm your host, Emily Shutt, a professional certified coach with over a decade of experience helping smart, driven women untangle their drama around money, relationships, and well being. I'm here to help you do the same using science backed coaching tools rooted in cognitive behavioral theory, positive psychology, and peak performance. You'll leave with actionable steps for approaching your own life with clarity and confidence. Let's get into it. So, when most people think about negotiation, they immediately picture the worst possible caricatures. It's always either the sleazy used car salesman with the bad veneers trying to upsell you on the undercoating. And if anyone watches Archer, we will recall in Midnight Ron, season 4, episode 4, Ron admonishes us to never get the undercoating. Or it's like the hyper aggressive Wall Street guy barking into his Bluetooth headset like he's personally keeping the stock market alive. We all know that guy. And then on the flip side, for women, the stereotype somehow becomes the girl boss negotiator, TM, as if that is the only option. Like, tell them it's this astronomical amount or you'll walk because you deserve it, sweetie. Like, okay, I love confidence. I love an affirmation moment, sort of. We'll talk about affirmations and brain science another time. But real negotiation is not a TikTok soundbite or a script that you have to memorize. These stereotypes make people cringe because they're so far removed from how actual humans communicate. Nobody wants to be the sleazeball. Nobody wants to be the bulldozer. I mean, most of us don't want that. And nobody really wants to be the hollow, aspiring influencer version of themselves because those personas are so far removed from our real lived experiences. There's a reason that they're cringe. And no one wants to be on the receiving end of those hyperbolic negotiation styles either, right? So then we panic and do nothing. Or we do the softest, most apologetic version of an ask and then call it a day. Like, especially with freelancers, when they're getting started in their industry, I see this a lot. They'll either try to push for premium pricing right out of the gate when they honestly just don't have the experience to back it up yet, or they'll offer to just do it for free. There's no middle ground. So those are the two extremes, and we want to learn how to place ourselves within that range in a way that feels fair and honest and sustainable. And we know what our reasons are for the way we approach something, and we like our reasons. So we feel good about it, regardless of parts of the outcome that we can't always control. The truth is, trying to adhere to one of those extremes is not true negotiation. It's just a performance and it's exhausting. True negotiation is not a personality that you have to put on. It's a skill that you already have the capacity to cultivate. So we need to start thinking about it that way. This is a skill that we learn over time, not something that we just innately have or don't have. Honestly, before I actually learned anything useful about negotiation, I thought it was always going to be this high pressure showdown where someone had to win and someone had to lose. And especially being socialized as a woman, even though I did want to quote unquote win in the sense that I wanted to feel like I could advocate effectively for my needs, I didn't like thinking of myself as aggressive and competitive. A lot of women are taught that this isn't the way that we're supposed to behave. And then even if I won, I'd be worried that I hurt the loser's feelings. So there's a lot of layers to this. I thought negotiation required me to suddenly transform into this ultra assertive version of myself. And like I was supposed to build a whole new personality just to ask for something I actually needed, or I felt really confident that I was, well within my rights to be requesting or to be seeking out. But here's the catch: my definition of assertive at the time did not align with who I am and who I wanted to be. It's just not who I am. So I actually started with redefining assertiveness. And this can be really helpful for a lot of us, I think. To me, I can get behind assertiveness as meaning honest, straightforward, and clear. I don't think of assertiveness as pushiness or being rude or trying to intimidate someone else into agreeing to what I want. So I think, we think about those adjectives. That's the way a lot of us have been socialized to think about assertiveness. So we want to, maybe push back on that inherent definition. Beyond the semantics of how we define a word, Underneath that, I had this idea, which a lot of women have, that negotiating meant I was being difficult or ungrateful or somehow messing up the vibes. And that is a big no no, where our brains will default to thinking that means we're going to get kicked out of the group and then we will die. We talk about this a lot. But once I started learning what negotiating actually is, I realized that it's basically just structured communication and it can be taught and it can be learned. It's two people trying to solve a shared problem with slightly different needs and perspectives. And that is not a life threatening situation. So it's not a battle, it's not a hostage situation, and it's definitely not an audition for the role of most aggressive employee. Negotiation is about clarity and collaboration. It's saying, here's what works for me, what works for you. And once you realize that, it becomes so much less dramatic and so much more doable. So, if you think of a situation where there is very limited drama, ideally, like making dinner plans with a friend, you're using the same framework. If you can meet at 7 and your friend can meet at 6, but has to be home by 8 for the kids' bedtime routine, maybe you opt for more of a fast casual place than a nicer sit down, even if that's what you would have preferred initially. Or maybe you scrap dinner and get coffee the next day instead. It's just what works for you, what works for them. And if it doesn't perfectly line up, it's not because one of you is bad or evil or inconsiderate. You're not like, wow, Sharon is such a bitch, and then end the friendship. You just work together to decide on something different that gets you and Sharon both closer to what you want. Thinking about it that way is a lot less intimidating, right? But we tell ourselves a story first that it's bad to negotiate because someone might not like it. And then if we get what we want, we're worried that they're mad or they'll eventually want to get even. And then if we don't get what we want, we feel taken advantage of or undervalued. So the stories we tell ourselves are what determine our experience in the world. So a lot of work in coaching is about clarifying what those default stories are and then deciding if we like what we get out of telling ourselves those stories. And then if not, how do we want to change them? Negotiation shows up outside of work way more often than we realize, which is part of why we get so stressed about it. We think it's this rare formal event that only happens in conference rooms when really it's hiding in almost every corner of everyday life. So, with some conscious adjustments, you can get a lot of low stakes practice negotiating so you feel more skilled when the big moments come. Like in romantic relationships, every time you're deciding whose family you're visiting for the holidays, that is a negotiation. I am recording this in the holiday season, and that is very much something that's going on right now for us. And to be real for a moment, sometimes those talks make salary discussions look like a walk in the park. Or household labor, like who's walking the dogs, who's unloading the dishwasher, who's doing the bedtime routine. That entire dance is one long ongoing negotiation. Friendships too, everything from where should we eat to where is this year's girls trip destination is a negotiation. We just don't call it that because that feels too official. Family is a big one. So parents, siblings, in-laws, anytime you are coordinating schedules, dividing responsibilities, or trying to set a boundary without setting off a small family emergency, you're negotiating. And the irony is, because we don't label any of those moments as negotiation, we don't give ourselves credit for the fact that we're actually pretty experienced already. But now I want you to take a moment and think about, for the example I shared, which of those might apply to you and how do you navigate those right now? We get tripped up at work because it suddenly feels higher stakes when money is involved, but the dynamics themselves, gathering information, finding common ground, communicating clearly, and setting boundaries, you've already been doing that for years. Maybe you're not thrilled about the way you've been doing it. If you always cave to what everyone else wants and then feel resentful, especially if they're not grateful enough for the sacrifices you feel like you've made, that's a cue that it's time to build some new negotiating skills. And these will apply to all types of negotiation, big or small. One of the moments that made me appreciate that I'm negotiating all the time was something ridiculously small in hindsight. It was how I would be attributed in an article that I was featured in when I was starting out as a coach. When I was newer to media features, I didn't know to ask for backlinks or references, which are an important part of it. And once I figured out that they were important, I still didn't feel comfortable asking this very basic question that is completely normal and expected to ask. I would just go for it and hope for the best. So early on, I had an experience where not only were there no backlinks, but I was completely misquoted and disappointed with how the article turned out. And if I had been more upfront about my own expectations, maybe they would have opted out of leveraging me as a source. But I also didn't like being attached to the end product. So in hindsight, it would have benefited me to get clarity up front and just acknowledge that it was maybe not a fit. Now I'm always clear about turnaround times and key details on any media exchange. I just went through this again last week. And part of that came from this minor unpleasant blip that really didn't matter in the long run. But the rest of it has come from years of experience I've gained since then and a lot of practice intentionally exposing myself to these low stakes negotiations and recognizing them as such until they no longer feel like a big deal. Those little practice sessions help prep you for the bigger negotiations, even if it doesn't seem like a direct link. You're building the muscle of voicing what you're looking for, being open and flexible about what the other party needs, and then coming to a resolution. So I want you to really pay attention to the way you describe your approach to negotiating at work versus other areas of your life. Maybe you wanna make some changes, that's totally fine, but don't sell yourself short as if you don't have any of these skills already or don't have any opportunities to practice and experiment with this already. When we assume negotiation automatically equals conflict, our whole nervous system starts reacting as if we're gearing up for a fight. And once you're in that mindset, everything gets distorted. A simple conversation becomes a potential battle, and a reasonable ask suddenly feels like a provocation. And the other person who might actually be very open to collaborating starts to look like an opponent that you need to outsmart. And here's the kicker: when we go into a conversation expecting conflict, we will show up in ways that practically guarantee conflict, right? We get defensive, we over explain, or we soften our ask to the point that nobody even knows what we're asking for. Or we go to the opposite extreme and come in way hotter than we intended because we're bracing for impact. It becomes this self fulfilling prophecy where the fear of conflict creates the exact dynamic we are trying to avoid. But negotiation at its core is not conflict. Like I said, it's clarity and communication. It's two people trying to solve a shared problem with slightly different perspectives. And when you approach it from that angle, the whole conversation shifts. You're no longer trying to win, you are trying to understand and create alignment. You are trying to get to the truth of what will actually work. And that's where the real power is, not in convincing someone or bullying them into agreeing to something, but in communicating clearly enough that the solution becomes obvious. Think about if you've ever found yourself overcorrecting, trying to sound more confident or bossy than you actually felt because you thought that's what negotiation was supposed to look like. I've worked with many clients who thought negotiating meant putting on this like slightly feral, overly authoritative version of themselves. Like they had to be the corporate alpha girl boss at all times, or they would just get trampled over. They'd inevitably overshoot the mark and then come to me dazed from reading too many LinkedIn hustle posts. And it's like, okay, we have a lot of recalibration to do here. So not surprisingly, it doesn't feel good and it rarely works. This is such a common overcorrection, especially for women, because we've been taught that confidence is loud and persistent and borderline aggressive. But we're also taught that we're not supposed to be that as women. So we think, okay, I'm going to advocate for myself. I guess I just have to get jacked up and going guns blazing. But like that doesn't necessarily always feel like you. If that is you, it's okay, right? Like if that's really your personality. But I think, for a lot of us, that's not actually the case, and then we're sort of given this conflicting advice about how we're supposed to, perform correctly, really, in society. So, what I like to see and what I work on with clients is eventually learning to embody this idea of being able to say, here's what I need without either apologizing or performing. And ironically, the more you lean into your natural communication style, not this borrowed bossiness, the stronger your negotiation becomes because there's no like frantic energy behind it, but only if you are clear on the thoughts that you're thinking, what you're making them mean, and then choosing them on purpose before going into the discussion. So, for example, at work, if your team has to negotiate holiday coverage internally, if your thought is that if you don't get Christmas Day off, it means they don't respect you, that's going to feel much more intense than if your thought is that everyone deserves a break and you would like Christmas off this year after being on call for the last two, but you're open to working Christmas Eve or New Year's Day. And that doesn't mean anything about you. If someone wants something else, that's probably going to feel less intense because not only are you clear on what you're looking for, but you also have to depersonalize it. And then you're going to be better primed to come up with equitable solutions without having a fight or making it mean something about what other people think about you. The overcorrecting is just a sign that you're operating from fear rather than ownership. Once you shift into clarity and collaboration, the whole thing feels so much more human and so much more effective. There are so many reasons women and honestly high achievers across the board feel immediate discomfort when asking for more or negotiating in any way. But at the core, it comes down to socialization and self concept. Most of us were raised to be low maintenance. Like, you don't ever want to be a problem, you don't want to make ripples. If you think about it, we never really hear of guys being as described as high maintenance, but we hear it as an insult about women quite frequently. That supposed ideal is to be easy to work with, easy to be around, easy to approve of, just easy. We got praised for being helpful, flexible, agreeable, not for being direct or bold or clear. So when it's time to make an ask, there's this knee jerk anxiety that we're suddenly becoming too much, even if what we're asking for is reasonable and fair. There's also the perfectionism piece. So, high achievers tend to assume that if they were truly exceptional, if they were really doing a good job, they wouldn't need to ask. The performance should speak for itself. Their boss should notice. Their partner should intuitively understand. The universe should basically just send a memo on their behalf. But negotiation assumes the opposite. The needs must be named, not assumed to be obvious. And then there's the fear of the label. Nobody wants to be seen as pushy, demanding, ungrateful, difficult, high maintenance. There it is again. Pick your poison. We have a very long, very well documented cultural list of words that get weaponized against women who advocate for themselves. So our brains do the calculus and decide, you know what? Silence is safer. But here's the truth: the discomfort doesn't mean that the ask is wrong. It means that you were never taught how to make it without feeling guilty. And that isn't a personality flaw or a moral failing. It's just a skill that needs to be developed that no one has helped us develop yet, right? Until now, here we are. So once you understand that, the whole negotiation process stops feeling like this moral test and starts feeling like what it really is, just a normal part of adult life and learning new skills. One of the biggest ways early socialization teaches women to avoid making things awkward is by rewarding us from a pretty young age for smoothing things over, being polite, keeping the peace, not upsetting anyone, and not asking for too much. And that conditioning runs deep. We're taught that being agreeable is admirable, being direct is risky, and advocating for ourselves is selfish, and people will be disappointed in us for that. So, of course, asking for really anything feels awkward. We've been trained our whole lives to preemptively scan other people's reactions and adjust ourselves accordingly. So, by the time we're adults, the idea of saying, hey, here's what I need, feels like we're violating some unspoken rule of feminine likability. We worry that we're going to create tension or disrupt the vibe or, God forbid, cause someone to have a feeling that is negative. But repeat after me: we do not cause other people's feelings. Other people do not cause our feelings. Our thoughts cause our feelings. Gendered expectations show up in negotiation in these really sneaky, almost invisible ways, the kinds of things women do without even realizing it because they've been rehearsing them since childhood. So, for example, a lot of women soften their ask to the point where it's not clear they're even asking for anything. The whole sentence gets wrapped up in these layers of disclaimers, apologies, like little emotional bubble wrap. And it's going to be something like, I mean, like, only if it's not too much trouble, or if you don't mind, or totally fine if not. Like, if it's not clear what you're asking for, how can someone give it to you? And then there's the hesitating. Women will wait until the perfect moment to ask, which doesn't exist, or they'll avoid the conversation entirely because they're terrified of being seen as inconvenient. You see the problem? It's not an issue of timing or content or scripting. It's an issue of being terrified of how you think you will be seen, which is a thought. It's just a thought, and you can change it. You're not in charge of how someone sees you anyway. You're in charge of what you make that mean about you. You're in charge of whether you decide something is a problem or not. Another thing I see a lot is over explaining. So, giving a dissertation length justification for a perfectly reasonable request when really just leveraging silence is going to be the best approach. And underneath all of that is that old script, like, be nice, be agreeable, don't create friction, don't be a problem. So women approach negotiation like they're trying to minimize their own presence in the room because they've equated the negotiation with a judgment of their worth in society, one where they will always be found lacking. All of these little habits have one thing in common: they blur the clarity of the ask, and in negotiation, clarity is power. The small softening moves feel polite, but they quietly erode your position, your confidence, and the other person's ability to understand what you actually want. Once you strip away the hedging, the apologizing, the disclaimers, and the permission seeking, your ask becomes clear, and then clarity is what is going to help you get results. So again, we want to reframe negotiation as mutual problem solving rather than a battle. If we think of the goal as expressing ourselves clearly and finding common ground, that's different from a win lose proposition. That much is clear. But again, The issue is not just how we tee it up or what script we use. It's really about addressing our fears that we will be perceived negatively. So we have to practice thinking different core thoughts, which allow us to feel less emotionally charged and more equipped to stay with it when things maybe get tense or awkward. A very basic thought reframe might be going from, I'm afraid they'll be mad at me, to, I'm allowed to do this. Or rather than, they're going to think I'm stupid for asking when it's obviously a no, we replace that with, there might be more flexibility here than I'm aware of, and I won't know until I ask. Or if they push back on what I want, they clearly don't respect me, it becomes, maybe pushing back is part of negotiation. It's not a statement about my worth. So we're shifting away from a judgment of our value or character and replacing those thoughts with more neutral language that's still believable. So, as you're hearing some of these examples and thinking about where those might come up in your own life, you might notice some emotional, shall we say, spiciness. What are the physical sensations you experience when you think about negotiating and when you're actually in the middle of it? Just imagining a future negotiation will activate your body's emotional response system as if it's already happening because your thoughts are what are causing those reactions. So, while we're learning to practice new thoughts, we don't have to wait until we've perfected it before we're allowed to go out and do things. We often will need to negotiate or do other uncomfortable things even without having a perfectly aligned catalog of thoughts readily available. So, this is why emotional regulation is such an important tool. Emotional regulation is everything in negotiation, not because you need to be a robot, but because the moment your nervous system goes into threat mode, your ability to think clearly pretty much evaporates. When you're dysregulated, whether that's anxious, defensive, bracing for impact, your brain shifts out of problem solving mode, that's the prefrontal cortex, and into self protection mode, amygdala activation. So we've talked about this in past episodes. And once you're in that state, the negotiation stops being about clarity and starts being about like survival. You're not evaluating options anymore. You're trying to backtrack out of discomfort or just like fight for your life. And that's when people start shrinking their ask, apologizing unnecessarily, talking in circles, or abandoning the conversation altogether because it feels too overwhelming. But when you can regulate your emotions, even just enough to stay reasonably grounded, you have access to your actual skills, your logic, your communication, your values, your ability to collaborate. You can listen without spiraling. You can make a clean ask without caving into panic. My life advice in all scenarios, negotiations, and beyond is to stay curious and not reactive. Emotional regulation isn't about pretending that you don't care about something. It's about anchoring yourself enough that the negotiation stays rooted in the present moment and the transaction being defined in real time, not your fears, not your assumptions, and not the stories your brain likes to run in the background. When we have some grounded, believable, and more neutral thoughts paired with emotional regulation skills, we're ready for collaborative negotiation. So, what does that actually sound like in practice? Collaborative negotiation is basically what happens when two people stay on the same team instead of slipping into me versus you mode. So it's less about haggling and more about clarity, transparency, and just problem solving. So in practice, that's going to sound like, here's what I'm looking for, what's important on your side, or here's why this matters to me, tell me what constraints you're working with. Or even, let's see where our priorities overlap and where we have wiggle room. So it's not fluffy. It's not like, I'll just take whatever you can give me. And it's definitely not passive. It's direct, but in a way that assumes the other person is capable of working with you, not against you. And I'll be honest, sometimes that's not the reality of the situation. And then that's a different conversation when someone's not able to meet you in a collaborative way to find mutually beneficial solutions. But let's assume for now that they are. It will be more helpful going in to assume that anyway. Collaborative negotiation keeps the conversations rooted in shared goals, things like fairness, clarity, sustainability, quality of work, long term alignment. Instead of posturing or performing confidence, you're actually engaging the other person. You're inviting them into the solutioning process. And when you do it well, the dynamic shifts from adversarial to actually building something together. You're both contributing information, exploring options, and trying to land on an outcome that makes sense for everyone involved. So keep in mind that preparation in terms of knowing your values, boundaries, and non negotiables is often more powerful than memorizing talking points. Sometimes in coaching sessions, early clients will ask for that. Like, how do I structure this? Like, what's a template I can use? And that's not the real issue. The issue is values, boundaries, non negotiables. approaching things with curiosity and a spirit of collaboration and being able to regulate yourself along the way. Preparation is powerful in negotiation, not because it gives you the right script, but because it gives you the right center of gravity. And that is the whole point of the work. So, like, yeah, you need talking points, right? Talking points, though, are surface level. They're helpful, but they fall apart the second the conversation veers off script, which it almost always does. The other person asks a question you didn't anticipate, or they counter with something that throws you off. And suddenly your beautifully rehearsed bullet points just like evaporate, right? But when you're anchored in your values and your boundaries and your non negotiables, you don't get knocked off balance as easily. So you can respond in real time because you know what actually matters to you. You're not grasping for the right line, you're speaking from a place of unshakable inner clarity. Values tell you why you're asking, boundaries tell you where you're flexible and where you're not. Non negotiables tell you what you're absolutely unwilling to compromise on. That speaks for itself. That combination gives you internal stability, which means you can stay calm, grounded, and present instead of relying on a script that might not fit the moment. An aligned negotiation is so much more powerful than a perfectly worded negotiation because you're not performing confidence. You're meant to be embodying it. You've done the work ahead of time to be really clear on what you want and why and what you'll do to get there. You can usually tell a negotiation is aligned when the conversation feels clean, not necessarily easy, not necessarily comfortable, but just clear. Like there's a sense of mutual respect, mutual curiosity, and mutual willingness to explore what could work. Both people are actually engaging in the information on the table instead of posturing or defending their egos. So, aligned negotiation is going to be okay, let's figure this out together, even if you ultimately disagree. When it's misaligned, you can feel that too. You're starting to force it, you're bending yourself over backwards and contorting in ways that you told yourself that you wouldn't. So, if you're trying to convince the other person of something they have no interest in understanding, that's going to be a misaligned negotiation. One of the biggest signs of a misalignment is that you leave the conversation feeling smaller or just like flat out, like you diluted your ask or your values or your boundaries just to keep the peace. If you walk away thinking that's not even close to what I need, then that's a red flag. And maybe we need to try again. So, another sign is going to be if the entire negotiation hinges on you abandoning something that actually matters deeply to you, that's misaligned, period. Aligned negotiation doesn't mean that you get everything that you want. Sometimes it does. It's nice when it works out that way. But what it really means is the process makes sense. It means you're telling the truth, they're telling the truth, and you're both just checking for a solution that fits. You're not forcing the puzzle pieces together. You're seeing whether they actually match. And when they don't, you don't internalize it or spiral or make it mean something about your worth as a person. You just recognize that this particular container is not the right one. So it's really not a big deal. A couple of years ago, I had to get an MRI and I was at the hospital for a long time because their machine wasn't working. Don't we love that? So while the technicians were troubleshooting everything and I'm just like sitting in a hospital gown with stickers all over me, the nurse started asking me about my life and what I did for a living. And I shared that I was a coach. And as so often happens, she had a lot going on in her own life that she wanted to run past me. So it was a fun way to pass the time for a bit. And then we finally got the machine rebooted, and I was about to go like headfirst into the scary, loud little tube. And she was like, "So, I guess what's like your one tip or piece of advice you have for people just in general?" I was like, that's kind of a big question while my head is like slowly going backwards into this tube. But right off the top of my head, I was like, I think I would just say stay curious and assume positive intent. And I think that absolutely applies in so many interactions in our lives and definitely in negotiations. You can assume positive intent. It does not cost you anything to do that. If the facts prove otherwise, you don't have to keep doing that. But going into any new interaction, that's my advice. Be curious about how to find common ground, be curious about how to make a negotiation a win for both parties, and assume positive intent that the other person wants a good outcome for both of you as well. This comes in really handy, not just at work, but also when your husband doesn't pick up his laundry or your friend bails on plans yet again. You can renegotiate based on your needs without personalizing it about yourself or the person that you're working with. So, here are some lines you can use if you're not really sure how to get started with this. One of my favorite ones, just for making an ask feel natural instead of apologetic, is just here's what I'm looking for. It's simple, neutral, and honest. There's no emotional preamble, there's no self-deprecation, we've all done that, or, no 10-layer disclaimer. It gets you right into the heart of the conversation without shrinking yourself or turning the ask into a confession. And another one you can use is what I need for this to work is blah, blah, blah. The phrasing is great here because it frames the ask in terms of function, not personal preference or worthiness. So you're describing the conditions for a sustainable agreement, not pleading for permission or for a concession of some kind. And if you want something that's strong and still collaborative, you could say something like, here's what I'm hoping for. How does that line up on your end? It's direct, but it also signals we're in this together, which takes the edge off the conversation without diluting the ask. So the key here is that none of these lines apologize for the ask before the other person even has a chance to hear it. They're grounded, they're clear, and they leave space for actual negotiation. Advocating for yourself is one of the most underrated forms of leadership because it quietly gives everyone around you permission to do the same. Like people are watching you. So when you model clear communication, not apologetic, not aggressive, just clean and honest, people notice that. On a team, it shows your employees or colleagues that it's safe to name their needs, set boundaries, and have real conversations instead of silently burning out. Most people don't learn true negotiation from a workshop. They learn it from watching how the people around them operate, and then they're actually practicing those skills in their own lives. So when they see you ask for what you need without spiraling or tiptoeing, it normalizes the behavior and then signals that it's safe for others to do the same. In a family, it's the same dynamic. Kids, partners, siblings, they're all paying attention to how you handle difficult or awkward moments. When you set a boundary or state a need or ask for support without turning it into a guilt fest or an apology tour, you're modeling emotional maturity. You're showing them that healthy relationships are about collaboration rather than mind reading. When you do that, you become someone who raises the standard for the whole system, which is pretty cool. You shift the equilibrium from let me not upset anyone to let me be honest so that we can all function better. So, as we wrap up for today, what's one small way to practice self advocacy outside of work to build that muscle? As you start practicing negotiating in low stakes situations, you're getting used to the language of negotiation and the feelings that come along with it, and simultaneously retraining your brain to view yourself as someone who can respectfully and effectively advocate for her own needs. That is always the goal. And as I say, with so many of these scenarios, it just takes practice. We don't learn to ride a bike by watching someone else ride a bike. We have to get on the bike and be willing to feel a little wobbly until we don't. So get out there and try. And remember, you're allowed to have needs and you're capable of learning the skill of negotiating. I hope you came away with some insights that you can apply in your own life right away. I'll see you next time.